I should have known something was off when I clocked in for my shift. The usual hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed muted, and an eerie silence hung like a thick fog. But hey, I was just the new night security guard. What did I know? My name is Marcus, and I work the graveyard shift at Bayside Memorial, a sprawling cemetery on the outskirts of town. It's a creepy gig to be sure, but the pay is decent, and the work is typically uneventful. That is, until a few nights ago when all hell broke loose. It started innocently enough. I made hourly rounds, checking the perimeter for signs of trespassers or vandalism. The first few laps were standard. I waved to the night shift groundskeeper, ensured the gates were locked, and shouted a few casual hellos into the darkness, just in case anyone was around. As I entered the older section of the cemetery, I couldn't help but shiver. The headstones here were ancient, some dating back over a century. Gnarled oak trees draped their twisted branches overhead, casting eerie shadows on the weathered grave markers below. It was the place that would normally give me the heebie-jeebies, but I'd grown accustomed to it over the past few weeks. That night, however, something felt different. The air was thick with unsettling energy, and the usual sounds of nature, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, were nowhere to be heard. It was as if the entire cemetery had been blanketed in a suffocating silence. I quickened my pace, eager to get this creepy section of my rounds over. As I rounded the corner, I froze in my tracks. In the distance, there was a figure, a tall, dark shape, seemingly gliding between the tombstones. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched it move, graceful and fluid, with an unnatural fluidity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. "Is someone there?" No response. The figure continued its haunting dance, vanishing behind a cluster of headstones. Swallowing hard, I reached for the baton at my hip, gripping it tightly as I crept forward. My footsteps crunched on the gravel, echoing through the eerie silence. As I drew closer, I could make out more details. It was humanoid in shape, but its movements were alien, almost ethereal. "This is Marcus, the night security guard," I spoke into the radio clipped to my collar. "I've got a possible intruder in the old section of the cemetery, requesting backup." Static crackled in my ear, followed by a muffled voice. "Copy that, Marcus. Hold your position. Help is on the way." Clutching the baton, I cautiously rounded the next row of headstones, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the strange figure. To my relief, it was nowhere to be seen. I let out a shaky breath, realizing I'd been holding it the entire time. "All right, Marcus, you've got this," I muttered, trying to steady my nerves. "It was probably just a trick of the light or something. Nothing to—" A sudden movement in the corner of my eye made me jump. I whirled around, baton raised, only to find myself face to face with the groundskeeper, Frank. "Whoa, easy there," he exclaimed, holding his hands. "It's just me." I let out a nervous laugh, lowering the baton. "Frank, you scared the crap out of me." The older man chuckled, adjusting his wide-brimmed hat. "Sorry about that. I didn't mean to sneak up on you. What's got you so jumpy tonight?" I quickly filled him in on the strange figure I'd spotted, watching as his expression grew increasingly concerned. "That's not good," he muttered, raking a hand through his greying hair. "You sure it wasn't just a trick of the light or something?" I shook my head. "No, it was real. It was moving with such purpose, like it was—" I trailed off, not wanting to voice the unsettling thought nagging at the back of my mind. "Like it was what?" Frank pressed, his brow furrowed. I swallowed hard. "Like it was looking for something." The older man's face paled. "Well, let's hope the cops get here soon. In the meantime, I'll keep an eye out. You stay close, all right?" I nodded, my grip tightening on the baton as we continued our patrol. The uneasy silence stretched, punctuated only by our footsteps crunching on the gravel. Every shadow seemed to hold a sinister presence, and I jumped at the slightest movement. After what felt like an eternity, the distant siren's wail finally broke the tension. I let out a sigh of relief as the police cars came into view, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow over the cemetery. The officers sprang into action, fanning out to search the grounds. Frank and I gave them a detailed account of what I'd seen, but the strange figure had vanished without a trace. "Are you sure it wasn't just a trick of the light or something?" one of the officers asked, eyeing me skeptically. I shook my head emphatically. "No, it was real. I know what I saw." The officer frowned, but before pressing the issue further, a shout rang out from across the cemetery. "Over here! I found something!" We all raced towards the source of the commotion, my heart pounding in my chest. As we drew closer, I could make out the silhouette of an officer kneeling beside a freshly dug grave, his flashlight illuminating the disturbed soil. "What is it?" the first officer demanded, his voice tense. "The casket," the other officer replied, his tone grave. "It's been tampered with." A chill ran down my spine as I inched closer, dread pooling in the pit of my stomach. Sure enough, the freshly turned earth around the grave had been disturbed, and the lid of the casket, which should have been securely in place, lay askew as if someone had pried it open. "Oh, God!" Frank breathed, his face ashen. The officers immediately began searching the area, combing through the disturbed soil for clues. I stood there frozen, my mind racing. Who would do something like this? And why? As the cops continued their investigation, I saw a sudden movement in the distance. I whirled around, baton raised, only to find myself face to face with a figure, the same one I'd spotted earlier. This time, I could make out more details. It was tall and slender, with a humanoid shape, but its movements were unnaturally fluid and graceful. Shadow obscured its features, but I could sense an evil presence. "Hey!" I stammered, my voice trembling. "Stop right there!" The figure paused, as if regarding me for a moment, then turned and began gliding away, disappearing into the darkness between the tombstones. "Wait!" I shouted, taking off after it. "Stop!" I heard the officers yell behind me, but I didn't slow down. I had to know what this thing as and what it was doing in the cemetery. My lungs burned as I chased the figure through the winding paths, weaving between the headstones. It was fast, impossibly fast, but I refused to give up. I had to catch it and stop it from doing whatever it was planning to do. Suddenly, the figure vanished, swallowed by the shadows. I skidded to a halt, my chest heaving, eyes frantically searching the darkness. Where had it gone? A sudden chill swept over me, and I spun around, baton raised. There, mere inches from my face was the figure, its features still obscured, but its presence palpable. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed, my limbs frozen in fear. The figure seemed to regard me for a moment, its head tilting slightly to the side. Then it reached out a long, spindly hand and... "Marcus! Marcus! Are you all right?" I blinked, disoriented, as Frank's worried face came into focus. The officers were behind him, their flashlights sweeping the area. "What happened?" one of the cops asked, his voice tense. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. I saw it again. The figure. It was right here before me, and then... "And then what?" Frank pressed, his grip on my arm tightening. I shook my head, my heart still pounding. "And then... it just disappeared." The officers exchanged a troubled look, and then one of them stepped forward, his expression grave. "Marcus, I need you to tell us everything you saw. And I mean everything. This could be crucial evidence." Nodding shakily, I recounted the encounter, describing the figure's eerie movements and unsettling presence in vivid detail. The officers listened intently, their brows furrowed in concentration, When I finished, the first officer let out a heavy sigh. Well, this is concerning, to say the least. We will need to call in some reinforcements for this one. As the officers began making calls, Frank turned to me, his face etched with worry. Marcus, I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you see anything else? Anything at all that might seem out of the ordinary? I hesitated, my mind drifting back to the disturbed grave. Well, there was the casket, the one you and the officers found. Frank's eyes widened. What about it? The lid was open, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. Like someone had pried it open. The older man's face paled, and he glanced nervously at the officers. Oh God, this is worse than I thought. What do you mean? I asked, my gut twisting with dread. Frank's gaze met mine, his expression grave. Marcus, I think we're dealing with something very, very dangerous here. As the night wore on, the cemetery became a hive of activity. More police officers arrived, along with a team of forensic investigators. They scoured the disturbed grave, taking samples and photographs, while the original officers continued their search for the mysterious figure I had encountered.
Frank and I were questioned extensively, and our accounts were scrutinized and cross-referenced. The officers seemed to take the situation incredibly seriously, which only heightened my sense of unease. Do you know what this thing might be? I asked Frank, my voice hushed as we stood off to the side, watching the investigation unfold.
The older man shook his head, his brow furrowed. I'm not sure, but it's not good whatever it is. The fact that it was tampering with a grave, that's deeply unsettling. I shuddered, remembering the figure's eerie presence still fresh in my mind. Do you think it's some grave robber? Or a murderer, maybe? Frank hesitated, his gaze drifting to the disturbed earth. I don't know, but I have a feeling it's something much worse than that. Before I could press him further, one of the officers approached us, his expression serious. Mr. Wilson, Marcus, I'm afraid we have some bad news. We both tensed, bracing ourselves for the worst. The forensic team has completed their initial examination of the grave, the officer continued in a low voice. The casket, it's empty. My heart dropped. Empty? But that means, yes, the officer interrupted, his eyes narrowing. Whoever or whatever was tampering with that grave, they took the body. Frank released a shaky sigh, running a hand through his greying hair. This is worse than I thought. Much worse. The officer nodded grimly. We're calling in the FBI. This is now a federal investigation. As the officer moved away to coordinate with the arriving federal agents, I turned to Frank, my mind racing. Frank, what the hell is going on here? I asked, my voice trembling. What could be so evil that it would desecrate a grave and steal a body? The older man's expression was grave, his eyes filled with profound sorrow. I'm afraid I don't know, Marcus. But I can tell you this. Whatever it is, it's not of this world. I felt a chill run down my spine, the weight of his words settling heavily in the pit of my stomach. Not of this world? Frank nodded solemnly. I've been working this cemetery for over 20 years and seen some strange things. But this is unlike anything I've ever encountered. He paused, his gaze drifting to the disturbed grave. I think we're dealing with something otherworldly, something dark and ancient. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. You mean like a demon or something? Frank shrugged helplessly. I don't know, Marcus. All I know is that whatever took that body, it's not human. And it's not something to be taken lightly. As the FBI agents arrived and the investigation intensified, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. The image of that eerie, ghostly figure haunted me, and the thought of what it might be capable of filled me with a bone-deep terror. Whatever was going on, I knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary grave robbery. This was something far more sinister, something supernatural. And I had a feeling that before this was all over, I would be in for the fight of my life. The night air grew colder as the FBI agents, clad in dark suits, swept through the cemetery with a professionalism that made the situation feel even more surreal. They cordoned off the area around the disturbed grave, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like beams from another world. I stood beside Frank, watching in silent trepidation as they worked. One of the agents, a stern-looking woman with sharp eyes, approached us. "Mr. Wilson, Marcus," she said, addressing us both with a curt nod. "I'm Special Agent Reynolds. I understand you've been quite involved in tonight's incidents." "Yes, ma'am," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "I saw something. It was here, then it vanished." Agent Reynolds' eyes flicked to Frank and then back to me. "Describe it again, please. Every detail you can remember." I recounted the sighting once more, the vision of the ghostly figure as vivid in my mind as if it were still before me. Frank interjected occasionally, confirming the strangeness of the evening and adding his observations from past nights, though nothing as chilling as what had transpired tonight. When we finished, Agent Reynolds nodded solemnly. "Thank you. Your accounts are consistent with some unusual activity we've been tracking. This isn't an isolated incident." Frank and I exchanged a glance, the same question unspoken between us. Had others encountered this spectral figure? Agent Reynolds seemed to read our minds. "We've had reports of similar disturbances at other historical sites nationwide. Grave tampering, sightings of figures, disappearances. We believe it's connected, possibly, cult activity." "Cult activity?" Frank echoed, skepticism and fear mingling in his voice. "Possibly," she repeated, her expression unreadable. "Or something even less conventional. For now, keep to yourselves what you've seen. We don't want to start a panic." As she walked away to join her team, Frank pulled me aside, his face tense. "Marcus, listen to me. I've heard things over the years, rumours among the grave diggers and groundskeepers about hauntings and curses. But this," he gestured towards the grave, "this is different. It feels darker, more dangerous." I nodded, watching the FBI agents work. "What should we do? I mean, if it's not just superstitions." "We stay alert and keep our eyes open," Frank replied. "And maybe do some digging of our own. Not in the graves," he added quickly, seeing my expression. "I mean digging for information. There's a history here, secrets buried deeper than these bodies. Maybe it's time we learn what's really under the surface." Over the next few days, the cemetery became a hub of federal activity. Agents came and went at all hours, their presence a constant reminder of the gravity of our situation. Frank and I did as we promised. We kept our eyes open and started looking for answers. We pored over old cemetery records, newspaper archives, and any folklore we could find about the area. Each information seemed to add another layer of mystery, pointing to a past filled with unexplained phenomena and dark tales. There were stories of a shadowy figure seen in the 1920s, a grave robbery in the 1970s that had gone unsolved, and countless tales of ghostly apparitions. One night, while poring over a particularly old ledger, I found a reference to a grave that had been sealed off a century ago, purportedly because of unholy disturbances. The grave was in the oldest part of the cemetery, neglected and nearly forgotten. The name on the tombstone was barely readable. Mordecai Fowler. No one had been buried in that plot since. "Frank," I called, my voice low. "Look at this. Do you think it's connected?" Frank leaned over my shoulder, his eyes scanning the ledger. Mordecai Fowler. I've heard that name before. He was rumoured to be involved in occult practices, witchcraft, maybe even darker stuff. Could this have something to do with the figure and the disturbed grave? I asked, a chill running down my spine. It might, Frank said thoughtfully. If that grave was sealed for a reason and someone disturbed it, they might have unleashed something they weren't prepared for. That night, we decided to visit the grave of Mordecai Fowler. Armed with flashlights and an uneasy sense of dread, we made our way to the old part of the cemetery. The air was thick with fog, muffling our footsteps as we walked between the ancient headstones. When we reached the grave, I felt an immediate drop in temperature. The ground was barren, the grass around the tombstone dead and withered. Frank and I stood there, the weight of the night pressing down on us. We didn't need to speak. The fear and the gravity of our discovery hung heavily in the air. Suddenly, a low moan cut through the silence, sending a jolt of fear through my body. We turned, flashlights darting across the dark cemetery, catching glimpses of something moving through the mist, a form, dark and distorted, like the figure I'd seen before. "Marcus," Frank whispered, his voice tight with fear. "It's here." Our adventure into the unknown was beginning, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever we had unearthed was only the tip of an ancient and terrifying iceberg. As the shadowy figure loomed closer, the fog swirling around it seemed to thicken as if it were drawing the very essence of the night into itself. Frank gripped my arm, his usual calm demeanour shattered by the palpable terror in the air. "Stay behind me," he whispered urgently. I could only nod, my fear rendering me speechless. We stood our ground, our flashlights fixed on the advancing figure, which appeared even more menacing as it approached. Then I realized the figure wasn't just moving towards us, it was shifting, changing shape as it moved, its outline becoming more defined, yet somehow more terrifying. It was as if it was made of shadows, stitched together by darkness. "Who are you? What do you want?" Frank called out, his voice echoing strangely in the thick fog. The figure paused, and for a moment the night fell silent, save for the distant sound of the wind rustling through the dead leaves. Then, in a voice that seemed both far away and intimately close, it spoke, a voice like gravel dragged over tombstones. "I am bound," it said, chilling us to the bone. "Released but incomplete, seeking what is mine." "What do you mean?" "What are you seeking?" I managed to stammer, my curiosity overcoming my fear for a moment. The figure remained silent, then slowly moved again, circling us as if inspecting us. It was then that the ground beneath our feet began to tremble slightly, the earth itself reacting to the presence of this unearthly being. "We need to go," Frank said, pulling me back. "We need to get more help." But as we turned to leave, the figure moved with astonishing speed, blocking our path. "The vessel," it hissed. "You will lead me to the vessel." Panic set in, and I felt a surge of adrenaline. "We don't know what you're talking about," I shouted, more in desperation than anger. The figure paused, slowly dissipating, melting back into the fog from which it had emerged. But before it vanished completely, it left us with a chilling promise. "Seek and you shall find. Fail and be found." As the presence receded, Frank and I were left standing in the cold night, our hearts pounding in our chests. The immediate threat was gone, but the words it had spoken hung heavily between us. "We need to figure out what it meant by the vessel," Frank said, his voice shaky after a moment. "This isn't just about ghosts or simple hauntings. That thing is something else, something much older and more dangerous." We made our way back to the safety of the cemetery office, our minds racing with questions. What was the figure? A ghost, a demon, something else entirely? And what was the vessel it sought? Our research became more frantic, delving deeper into the history of the cemetery and Mordecai Fowler. We learned that Fowler had been a practitioner of what was described in hushed tones as dark arts, involved in rituals that were said to have opened doorways to other realms. "It's looking for something Mordecai used or created," Frank concluded, reviewing the records of ancient texts and artifacts. "Something powerful enough to be called a vessel." Determined to prevent whatever catastrophe might occur if the figure reclaimed this vessel, we sought help from an unlikely source, an expert in paranormal research and occult history, Dr. Elena Mirov, who Frank knew from his early days in the cemetery business. We arranged a meeting with Dr. Mirov, explaining the situation as best we could without sounding like we had lost our minds. She listened intently, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully as we described our encounters. "This entity you've described," Dr. Mirov said slowly, "sounds like it could be a guardian spirit, bound to protect or perhaps eternally seek a powerful object. These spirits are often created through rituals meant to guard precious items. Then, stopping it might mean finding this vessel before it does," I suggested. "Exactly," she replied. "And if this spirit was released by disturbing its grave, then finding the vessel and properly sealing it away again might be the only way to appease or banish it." Armed with new resolve and a clearer goal, Frank, Dr. Mirov and I planned our next steps. We would comb through every record, explore every inch of the cemetery, and uncover whatever secrets Mordecai Fowler had left behind. Our journey into the dark history of Bayside Memorial was far from over, and we knew that the stakes were higher than ever. As we delved deeper, we couldn't shake the feeling that the answers we sought were as dangerous as the spectral figure haunting the shadows of the graveyard. Our investigations deeply explored the archives and lore surrounding Mordecai Fowler and the cemetery. Dr. Mirov proved invaluable, guiding us through ancient texts and cryptic references that would have otherwise been indecipherable. We uncovered tales of Mordecai engaging in forbidden rituals, aiming to bridge the mortal realm with darker planes of existence. His reputation had been marred by rumors of sorcery and dealings with demonic entities, making it increasingly clear why such a spirit would be tied to him and his final resting place. As days turned into nights, our research began to converge on a particularly intriguing artifact mentioned sporadically in various texts, a dark, crystalline vessel purportedly used by Mordecai to contain the essences of the spirits he summoned. This vessel, it seemed, was not merely a tool, but a powerful conduit for otherworldly energies designed to offer control over the spirits it held. "This must be the vessel that the figure seeks," Dr. Mirov concluded after we had pieced together fragmented accounts from old journals and witness testimonies. "If Mordecai used this crystal to control spirits, then it's possible that the spirit doesn't want to reclaim it, but rather to destroy it, to finally free itself from his control." With a potential target in mind, we devised a plan to locate the crystal. According to the records, it was last seen with Mordecai before his death and was likely buried within his crypt. The challenge was finding it without attracting the spirit's attention, which we knew was still lurking, waiting for its chance to strike. We approached Mordecai's crypt under the cloak of night, equipped with everything from salt and iron filings to digital EMF meters. The air was thick with a palpable tension, and the earlier eerie cemetery silence now felt heavy with whispered threats. As Frank worked on the crypt's lock-old but surprisingly sturdy, Dr. Mirov prepared a circle of protection around the entrance with salt and chalk inscriptions. I watched the shadows, flashlight in hand, half expecting the spectral figure to emerge at any moment. Finally, the lock gave way with a loud clunk that echoed ominously through the cemetery. We stepped inside, the air stale and musty with the scent of decay and old earth. The crypt was cluttered with artifacts, books, and what appeared to be ritual paraphernalia Mordecai's personal effects, undisturbed for decades. Dr. Mirov and I began searching through the items while Frank watched. The tension was unbearable, each sound making us jump, each shadow a potential harbinger of the returning spirit. After hours, my hand brushed against something unusually cold and smooth. Pulling it from a pile of dusty cloths, I held a dark, crystal-like object, its surface swirling with a smoky, liquid darkness. "I think I found it," I whispered, trembling with fear and awe. Dr. Miroff rushed over, her eyes widening as she examined the crystal. "Yes, this is it. We must act quickly." We decided to reseal the crystal within the crypt, using a combination of old rites and modern paranormal containment techniques that Dr. Miroff had developed. As we prepared the ritual, the air grew colder, the earlier oppressive atmosphere escalating into an almost physical pressure. Just as we began the chants, a shadow swept across the walls, the figure emerging like a storm from the night. It moved towards us, its form more terrifying than ever, fury and desperation evident in its approach. "Quickly!" Dr. Miroff shouted over the growing wind inside the crypt. We continued the ritual, our voices blending into a powerful chant, while Frank threw down more salt and iron filings at the figure, slowing its advance. With a final, desperate shout, we completed the ritual. A bright light erupted from the crystal, engulfing the room and the figure. The spirit screamed, a sound not of this world, full of pain and rage before dissipating as the light receded. Exhausted and shaken, we stood in the now silent crypt, the threat seemingly neutralized. Once dark and swirling, the crystal had turned clear, its surface calm. "We did it," Dr. Miroff said, a mixture of relief and sorrow in her voice. "It's over, at least for now." As we left the crypt, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, casting long shadows across the graves. The cemetery felt peaceful, the earlier hostility gone. We knew, however, that our actions had perhaps only temporarily halted a cycle that had been in motion for over a century. In the following days, we monitored the cemetery closely, but no further disturbances occurred. Though we hoped we had ended the threat, each of us knew deep down that the world of the paranormal was never so predictable. The crystal remained locked away under strict conditions, a testament to the dark history it contained and the potential dangers it posed. As for me, I continued to work the graveyard shift, now more aware than ever of the thin veil between our world and the realms beyond. Each night, I walked my rounds with a new respect for the mysteries hidden in the shadows of Bayside Memorial, vigilant and prepared for whatever might come next. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more spine-chilling tales. Don't forget to hit the bell icon to stay updated with our latest videos. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment below and share your scary encounters. Also, consider joining the Fear Frequencies community for exclusive perks and early access to new content. Your support helps us create even more thrilling stories. And if you really enjoyed it, please consider leaving a super thanks.